I'm Jeff Abshire. I'm the instructor here at the Frostic School of Art, and I'm also the director of the Kalamazoo Book Arts Center. And I want to welcome all of you for the lecture tonight by our visiting artist, Aimee Lee. This program is co-sponsored by the Kalamazoo Book Arts Center and also by the Special Collections Department at the Zhang Legacy Center and the Frostic School of Art, with a grant from the WMU Visiting Scholars and Artists program. Aimee Lee is an artist and paper maker and author and book artist, and she has been a Fulbright Scholar twice to Korea. First time that she went to Korea, some 15 years or so ago, she learned this process for making a very special traditional kind of Korean paper called hanji. She brought her knowledge of that process back here to the United States and built the first hanji paper studio at the Morgan Paper Conservatory in Cleveland, Ohio, which is where I met Aimee the first time that we met many years ago. She also wrote a book called Hanji Unfurled, which is won numerous awards. And then she was awarded a second Fulbright to return to Korea to do additional research, including research on making the tools that she used to make this very special kind of paper. So she has been all over the United States, has been in many residency programs throughout the United States, including at the Penland School of Crafts, Women's Studio Workshop. Her work as a book artist and printmaker is in collections including the Metropolitan Museum, Museum of Modern Art, Brooklyn Museum, Yale and Harvard University Libraries. And so she's also, in addition to being sponsored by WMU, last year the Kalamazoo Book Arts Center won an award, a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts to host Aimee here. She's been here now for 2 weeks, working in our studio down at the Book Arts Center on a project. It's been great to have her here for 2 weeks. And she also has an exhibit of her work at the Zhang Legacy Center, which you can go and see through mid-January, and at the Kalamazoo Book Arts Center, which opens Friday night. So I hope that all of you will come to. In fact, we just finished painting that show this afternoon, so we hope that you guys can come on Friday night to the opening of her exhibit. So with that, I will introduce, please welcome Aimee Lee.
Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Jeff. Thanks so much to the Book Arts Center. It's been so great. I'm really sad that I'm leaving on Saturday, and I already have ideas in my head of how I'm gonna come back. And I actually thought this morning I should move here, but I'm not gonna do that, but it would be nice. So, start this. I just wanted to start with a little bit of family history. So this is the wedding photo of my great aunt Lee Hee-ho to the Kim Dae-jung, who would eventually become the president of South Korea in the late 90s. And I show this actually because my grandfather is in this photo. By then, their parents had died, so he was the eldest son, so he was kind of in charge. And he was, because of her marriage, they thought she was marrying kind of a bum. In terms of, she was marrying into the resistance, the political resistance, and they, so my family was punished for that. He was in prison for at least 16, not my grandfather, but Kim Dae-jung, for at least 16 years. They tried to assassinate him. She was under house arrest for a long time, and they basically took away all positions of power. So my grandfather had to retire early. He worked in early stock company in Korea, but he couldn't keep working. But what he really loved to do was photography, and he built his own darkroom in his house, which was a big deal, and obviously he had the means to do something like that. But this is a picture of my father, which is one of his kids, and then myself and my younger sister in New York, where we were born and raised. So my parents they immigrated and met each other in New York, and I just think about my grandfather in terms of both this just kind of doing what you want, like building your own space in your home, which I've done, and then also the idea of being able to frame your own important to me. So the other thing that I think had this kind of unconscious effect on me was growing up next to the Hudson River, and it's actually a river, it's an estuary, which means that it flows in both directions, sometimes at once, which is really weird, but it's kind of amazing. And I think that set me up to become a paper maker, which involves a lot of this moving water and repetitive motion. I went to grad school in Chicago back when Columbia College had a program in book and paper arts, and that's where I started to make paper. And I started to make paper because I wanted to make books, and that's why I chose to put this program. It was in book arts, and I started making books at the end of going to Oberlin College. And I fell in love with artist books because you could combine so many different media. You could combine writing, which I love doing. It was really always this push and pull, do I want to be an artist or a writer? But I could do both in an artist book. I could do visual work. I could turn the book into so many things that I was interested in, whether it was an installation or a performance. And this was one of my performances at the Chicago Cultural Center, and it was around stories and journeys, and trying to reactivate these stories that used to move through this space that used to be the central circulating room of when this building used to be the public library in Chicago. And as you can see, I was trained as a violinist, and I was trying to figure out ways to incorporate that into my work. And what you can't see is behind me I've attached, there's a whole handmade paper kind of train that I was dragging behind me, and I'm reading stories on handmade paper written by people in the audience. This was a 3-hour performance, and they would just write these stories about journeys, and I would translate it into music. And then by the end of graduate school, this was on the left is an MFA thesis, and I called it Pumpkin Door. It was based off of, that title was based off of a George Harriman comic, Crazy Cat, and he wrote in the most fascinating ways, and he grew up in New Orleans, and they basically, he hid his whole life that he had, I can't remember how far back, but that he was of Black descent, and so it was not safe at that time in terms of him being able to have a job and a family and a nice life. But that idea of like the patois that was spoken in New Orleans, and so some of you may not know hunky-dory is a phrase, but that's the way that he phrased it. And this was kind of a multi-layered piece where I made over 2,000 bricks made out of paper, and it was a self-portrait, and then there was an activating performance inside for the opening where I drew comics on the faces of loose bricks instead of kind of having and then I would only get those stories because you would have to come inside the structure and talk to me about yourself, and then I would draw as if I was learning about you, a comic about you, and then I would give it to you. And then instead of a traditional guest book outside, I had slips of paper where you could write back to me and then tuck it into the bricks inside of the installation. So once it came down, there were all kinds of messages that I hadn't seen previously. But I show this image because when my family came to see this show, my mother asked if I'd been thinking about this other structure when I made it, which is the oldest observatory of this time that still stands, and it's a national treasure in Korea, and it's something that I have been obviously storing in my head for years, because at the end of Oberlin I made a book about my parents before they met, and because I had images of them in front of this structure, and I had images even of myself as a teenager being dragged to this structure, because it's like one of those things. I don't know what you do here in Michigan, but I grew up in New York, and so our field trip would be, or day trip to Philly to see like Liberty Bell, and then our overnight was to DC to see all the Washington monuments. But it's that kind of thing where everyone has this picture, and I realized that there was this connection somehow, even though it's inverted, and I realized I had already been on this path trying to learn about Korean paper, that to figure it out, I had to go to Korea, and that I wanted to figure out a way to be connected to Korea that was not through my family, but through my art. So I went on Fulbright, the first one, and I learned how to make kanji, which is Korean paper. Kanji is Korean paper, so that word kanji means Korean paper. And this very specific way of moving a screen through a slurry of fiber and water and formation aid, that's what I want to learn. But of course, you think that you're going for one reason, but you learn so much more. But I wanted you to just see at least a few of the steps involved in making this paper, because it's very, very, very labor intensive and time intensive, but it's something that still a few people practice today, and I didn't want it to die out before documenting it. So before you even can make the paper, you have to prepare a formation aid, which I mentioned earlier. It's this gooey mucilage that comes out of plants, and certain plants have a lot of it. So these are the roots of hibiscus flowers. You have to seed them every year. You have to let them grow. You have to pinch off the flowers as they're growing, so they send a lot of energy to make fat roots, and then you beat the roots and you soak them in cold water, and then they ooze this mucilage that is kind of like the consistency of egg whites, and you strain it, and you need that before you make the paper. But also before you make the paper, you have to get the fiber for the paper, so that's paper mulberry trees that you harvest one by hand. You steam it so that the outer bark will pull away from the inner woody core, and then you have to scrape off the outer layers of this by hand with a knife so that you can get to the inner white layer, which is what you need for really good paper. And then you can dry it to store, or you can just start cooking it. And the cooking solution requires that it's alkaline, and to get that solution, you have to harvest other plants. So these are pepper plants that have been harvested, burned, and then you send hot water through them to create the alkalinity. And then after you cook them, you have to pick out every little piece of bark remaining by hand. And then these days they have these mechanized beaters, so that you don't have to beat as much by hand, but I beat by hand, and they all my students beat by hand. Some people actually prefer doing that, because you can control better what's happening. You can see exactly what's changing. Then you're adding water and that fishy fiber to the vat. You agitate for half an hour. You add that mucilage. You agitate for another half an hour, and then you can start sheet forming. So there's a bamboo screen that sits on top of a wooden frame, and just my thumbs that are holding it in place. You pass it through front to back, side to side, multiple layers of building, and you can barely see it because this fiber is basically transparent when it's wet, but there's a sheet of paper there, and I need to get it off the screen so that I can use the screen again to make more paper. So you can see it's going to lay down, and there's already this growing stack of paper, which is called post, and it's just going to stick to that. So I'm just going to release the front edge, and then before I take the screen away, you can put one thread down on the front edge, and this only happens between every other sheet. So it doesn't happen for every sheet. And you can see I'm putting my hands in hot water. This vat is ice cold. People used to work in the winter. It was farmers working during slack season. It would reduce bacterial growth of anything. And also that mucilage turns into water if it gets too hot, so it's really done in the winter. But there's a reason for this, every other sheet. So you can see that first stitch, front to back, and then side to side. So the side to side, you can go left and right, and even out the edges, but that front to back sheet, all the slurry starts in the front, and then fiber distributes on the way down. The front edge is a little thicker, and I can't get back to front bit because of the rope. So I'm flipping the screen. Every other one, I'm flipping the screen. So then the thick edge of one sheet meets the thin edge of the other, and then there's a thread, and so on and so forth. So it's two sheets always that make one traditional sheet of kanji. And so they call that unyanji or munsan paper. That would be like yin-yang theory, right? Two parts making a whole. And then what I did in videotape, which really took a very long time to form, is putting it into a press, and they had a screw press and a hydraulic press as well. And you usually leave it overnight, very slowly press out the excess water, and then you can see how much that post has compressed. And now I can pull out the top thread, and you pull out one by one, and that will release the front edge of that top sheet, and then you use the stick to pull it away evenly. Behind me is a stainless steel heated dryer, and they heat it with steam, and this is a forced drying system, meaning you're not letting it dry naturally, you're forcing it to dry faster than it would. And you have to brush it on, and there's a specific pattern of brushing it on. You have to get the top edge on first so that you can hold the bottom edge, and you have to go really fast. And because I was just learning at this point, this is like very slow. This is way slower, because it's already drying at the top, and you want even drying. But the nice thing is there's room for 3 sheets, so by the time that last sheet goes down, steaming the first sheet, I'm checking to make sure it's dry and it's already dry. So you just kind of go in the circle. And then the last step of finishing the paper is called poaching, and it's a way of hammering. And you're hammering to reduce ink bleed, to increase surface sheen, compact fibers, and make it stronger. And so those are just a few of the, and this is, my teacher thought that I would be lonely when I was working, so he turned on the radio to AFKM, which was like the old military station, playing these American songs, and I didn't want to insult him by turning it off in the video, so that's why it's in here. But I got in trouble on YouTube. They're like, you have your unlicensed use of this song, and so I had to redo that. But so then when I came back, I did that, and I learned many other things, many different ways of manipulating and using the paper, and I wanted to share everything with people that were back home, and so obviously I wanted to continue making paper, and I had to make a studio to do that because there was no place equipped to do that. The Morgan Conservatory in Cleveland offered to do that, essentially, and so we set that up in 2010, so I came back in 2009. We set up the studio in 2010. I wrote this book in 2012, talking about all of my research plus building this studio at the Morgan. And then I decided to move to Cleveland in 2013, and that's where I've been since, because I wanted to be close to the studio. I've since left there, and I built my own studio, and then left there, and I'm building a new one. So, but I wanted you to have also a little bit of background about Korean paper. So this sutra was discovered in the 1970s in a stupa of a Buddhist temple, and up until then they thought that the oldest existing woodblock print on paper was Japanese, and this predates it. So they found this scroll, and you can see it's kind of disintegrated, but what was even more disintegrated was a silk wrapper around it, and so that's why they came up with this saying in Korea that silk lasts 500 years, but energy lasts for 1,000. Because you can see the date, right? It was discovered a century later. In Buddhist culture, which is part of early Korean culture, very, very formative, you would commission, if you were rich, you would commission these beautiful sutras that they look black. They're actually indigo dyed so much that with glue that it turns black, or it looks so dark, and then illuminated with gold and silver. And you would commission these, of course other people made them for you, for your good karma. And in this specific sutra, they even say in the sutra how to grow your trees and how to perfume them and then harvest them to make the paper to be able to properly worship, in a sense, by making these sutras. So woodblock printing or xylography was the way that most manuscripts, or once you went from manuscripts to printing, that was the most common form of printing in Korea. It was just the fastest way. It looks like it's very slow, but these carvers are very skilled. So you would take a very thin sheet of paper. The person doing the manuscript would do all the writing. They would glue it up, paste it face down on the wood block, and then the carver would go and carve around. Because it was so thin, you could see and so it's all in relief, so it's backwards, and carve around the characters. And this was much faster than doing things like movable type. But and then you start to get print and book culture, and this is one of the Korean national treasures. So I don't know how to pronounce it. I say Tripitaka, but I could say Tripitaka. But it means the 3 baskets, and it's 3 baskets of the canon of the Buddhist canon. And so this is over 80,000 woodblocks that were carved twice, because when they were invaded by the Mongolians, they burned the whole thing to the ground. So they had to do it twice. They've gone through every block, and it's like over 1 million characters, and they have no errors. And it's housed in this temple in the southern part of Korea, where when it was discovered, they immediately conservators like, oh my God, we can't leave it in this temple with dirt floors and everything. And they took it into a climate control situation, and then they watched the wood blocks start to disintegrate. And they realized, oh my God, the monks had already figured out the perfect. They built this temple, they architecturally understood the way that you needed to run airflow, and the dirt floor was to absorb moisture, and so they brought everything back. And so this, you need really high clearance to see this. You can't just go in, you can see lots of replicas, but even though woodblock printing was the main way that they were printing, the Koreans were actually the first to invent metal movable type. So the Chinese were the first to do movable type but in clay. The Chinese language is not amenable to setting type because there are so many characters. And the Korean language is better, but it's still challenging. So they did that, and then this is the oldest book that still exists in the world that is printed with metal movable type. And you can see this is before Gutenberg, right? Almost a century before Gutenberg. And it's, this is a short name, Chi-Chi, but it's like a long name, and it's, again, a Buddhist text about the right way of living, and it lives in France, and so there's another Korean national treasure, and there's a big controversy with like, why did the French have it, and it's in the National Library in Paris, and, but it is, so this is another, major achievement, except they didn't continue because it just wasn't, the Roman alphabet works a lot better for movable type. So any of you who have gone and who have printed letterpress or done that at the Book Art Center would understand. But other ways that paper was used in Korean culture, those hinging screens, a lot of the mechanism of the hinging was happening with paper. You don't see it, but it's happening. They hinge it with paper and then cover it in silk and paper. Sewing boxes, and even the characters all cut out of paper. This fan, which is actually, you can see it in Library of Congress in the maps and the division, and it has actually a map of Jeollado, which is one of the southern provinces on it. And then this little table, which is all woven and lacquered, and that was, you would just sit at it and eat on it. And then this is at the Cleveland Museum of Art, and it's a wedding gown because back then, if you were not wealthy, you could not have something like this and get married in it. So it was shared among the villagers. So in your community, you would wear it when you get married, and then the next woman who got married would wear it. Because it's the silk and the embroidery, it's so expensive. But you can see here, here, and here, the places that touch your skin the most, it's actually covered in punji. And then, because that they could swap out and not wear so much on the silk. And then you can see for like royal headdresses, they would have this, that's on the left is actually, the black part is all horsehair, but then the gilded part is all paper. It's also in the Cleveland Museum of Art. The mask is for a mask dance form called taichung, which is a way that actually lower class people could make fun of their rulers, and it was kind of almost a way of political satire, and these and masks of different characters that they would do, and that's all kind of using paper mache technique and casting. And then hat boxes where you just use calligraphy paper practice and just paste it around a form. And then from head to toe they were wearing hanji. So these are all shoes that are made actually out of paper. And paper is insulated, it's very warm, so to keep your feet warm. This was more like in the home, straw shoes outside. If you really wanted to wear a paper shoe outside, you have to put a wood sole on it. In war, paper was very useful. So those two drawings that are actually paper armor. So if you layered many sheets of paper and then lacquered it, and this is before guns, so this is to withstand bows and arrows, but for your arrows, you can store them in your quiver that's woven out of kanji and then lacquered. And then maps and these atlases. These are also at the Library of Congress if you ever want to see them in DC. And they're all on recycled paper because paper never went to waste. And then doors and windows were all just a wood lattice work that were coated in paper, and then every year you would rip it off and then get new paper. And so that's how paper makers stayed in business. And then for ritual use. This is during Buddha's birthday, where they have thousands of lanterns hanging all over the temples, and this is in Chogyesa, which is one of the biggest temples in Seoul. So I went to study with, on 3 different trips that I've been to, I wanted to study with people who actually practice this. And so you can see these are some people, unfortunately, we've lost. Gwen, who is the screen maker, and Chang Yong-hoon, who is the father of my first kanji teacher. and they've since passed away. But and as you can see, no one's like that young. I mean, my teacher is the youngest, but so I wanted to bring it in some form to the U.S. And so you can see on the left that's the paper mulberry trees that are growing wild just near a Buddhist nun's temple, and she also makes kanji. And then this is what they call, in Japanese, kozo is the name for paper mulberry, and we call it kak in Korean. And that's the kozo garden that they had planted at the Morgan Conservatory, which is part of the reason that I wanted to site the studio there, because they had the plans to make it. And then you can see this process of steaming and stripping. You can see this process in Korea being done on a much larger scale, but in Cleveland, every second November, weekend in November, they will do a public kozo harvest where you can come and you can volunteer and help strip and scrape and be fed, because it was always communal work. And so then this knife, the scraping of the bark, that was something that I had this knife that was, you can see that very right one was a knife that I got from someone who had done research in Korea, and then I had to prototype it with an American blacksmith. And you can see another version of the knife in the museum exhibit at the top right, and it's on these scraping platforms, and then we tried to replicate them in Cleveland. And again, on the left, on the top and bottom, scraping the bark, and then burning pepper plants to make ash, and then on the right is doing that, scraping the bark in Cleveland, and then using wood ash. Wood ash is from a wood burning stove to make that cooking solution. Cooking outside in Korea, cooking outside in Cleveland, taking all the bark, cleaning the bark in Korea, and then these are high school students who are on a field trip trying that out. And then Dart Hunter, who was from Chillicothe, Ohio, and he traveled the world to research different paper making traditions all over the world. I mean, he met Gandhi, all kinds of stuff, but he took these very rare photos of, and he visited Korea in 1933, that's during the Japanese occupation, and his hosts were Japanese. So there was a very big bias of Korean paper being very crude and Japanese paper being much better, but you can see some of the steps of paper making in that one photo. And then this is my last studio that I just moved out of, teaching. This is a Korean adoptee who grew up in France, who came all the way to Cleveland to study with me to learn more about her birth culture. And then I was talking about the hibiscus plants, so there are those seeds, those are seeds in Korea, and then these are seedlings in Cleveland, and then growing them in Cleveland. I often just use a polymer that mixes up, because I don't always have access to the land and the time to be, especially when you're teaching students. You can substitute sometimes okra for the same kind of glue that you want, but this is from my last teacher of kanji making. He uses the actual roots. And then this is another one of Dart Hunter's images. So it's a bamboo screen, and it's all sewn horsehair. That's why the lines are black. And that's the only thing that we haven't been able to replicate in Cleveland, and that's why I went back on that second Fulbright to try to research the screen making. The one man who's designated, who's since passed away this January, to make screens for kanji making, he was already kind of, had dementia when I met him, and his wife showed me kind of the basics, but she wouldn't let me sit with her and really practice. So then I had to go all the way to another city in the very, very southern part of tip of Korea. It's like where Japan would always come to invade, in Pyongyang, and it's a beautiful place. It's just like hundreds of islands. And I found this guy, Cho Dae-yong, who was the national treasure of making bamboo screens in general. And I figured this is the closest I can get. He knows how to process the bamboo, and he might not know how to make it for the screens, but at least I can get, I hiked with him into the mountains, and we cut down the bamboo and everything, so we were starting from scratch. And he was 70 at the time, he's now in his mid-70s, and he was doing it since he was 10 years old. So even things that look like weeds, burdock, my kanji teacher would grade, he would seed it so that he could harvest right before the flowers bloom. You harvest the burrs, which were the inspiration for the person who invented Velcro, and you use them as like little scrubbies to clean your screen. And then you can see again the the teachers I studied with above in Korea, and then setting up the VAT in Ohio, and then believe it or not, after I moved to Ohio is when I learned that Ohio is next to Michigan. I didn't know that. And so I had this great residency at Albion College, and I got to set up a portable VAT that I would travel with and make lots of hanji out of different fibers. And then you can see the boarding process. Those are the old photos of boarding it on paper, on wooden boards and leaving it overnight to dry. That is an image in Gwangju, which is further north in Korea, where they're using this heated steel plate. And then this was in my last studio, one of my students, and I had laminate board that I just mounted directly to the wall, which is basically like what they use in like shower surrounds. And then you can see in Korea, this was a really sad thing that Dart Hunter noted. He said, the Japanese, this is probably the first ever school of paper making, like educational way of teaching paper making, but because the Japanese paper makers felt that the Korean method was too slow to embrace, it's 2 sheets, is that they're like, this is way too slow, we want you to do our method, which is faster. And so they were forcing Koreans to learn the Japanese method. And so Dart Hunter was saying that method is the Korean method is gonna die out. And so to prevent that, that's what I've been working on, is try to teach privately, but also different book art centers around the world, actually. And this is in Michigan at Oxbow, when I taught at PBI, which is Paper Book Intensive. And it's hard to see, but there's 3 hanji bats. So one was by Morgan, one was by a student who had her own and brought hers, and one was mine. And so it's not exactly, I'm not forcing the Japanese to make hanji, but I am teaching Americans. So I wanted to show you a little bit about my own work. This is you can see that's a gold crown from the Shinda era in Korea, and that's like, let's say 600 around there, 600 to 900, and 600 maybe 1200. But they were known for this intricate gold work and these elaborate crowns with these jewels, these jade jewels, and these kamas that they still don't know they don't understand what they meant. They were like, were they meant to look like fetuses that meant like life, or were they meant to look like, we don't know. But I just love this image, and also I love the legacy of that actually comes directly from the Silk Road. There are crowns that look very similar that were excavated in present-day Afghanistan. So there was a sense that people would call Korea the Hermit Kingdom, like it was totally isolated, and it was not. So this developed out of Central Asian culture. And so then I tried to replicate some of those in paper. So this is all paper, and then using bark the bark that makes the paper, and I'm going to make it to thread. So those are the connectors instead of wire for all of the ornaments. And in a similar way, I've seen an exhibit in New York of Kyrgyzstan, artifacts from Kyrgyzstan, present-day Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, where they had a piece in the museum that was like rolled pieces of gold that are attached to another gold plate, and they said in the museum tag, we have no idea what this is. And I just love this idea of mystery that will always exist, whether it's parts of nature that we'll never understand why birds sing in this way, or why humans behave in the way that we do. And I started to try to roll paper and attach it to canvas, or not canvas, but like another piece of paper. But I quickly realized I didn't want it to be on a rectangle, and for some reason it needed to be in a garment. And I think this is because this was a time, let's say 2012, I made these in Santa Fe on the residency. I didn't have a home studio. I was just traveling all the time to residencies, and this was a way of, like the idea of traveling like with only the shirt on your back. And so the art was literally attached to the clothing. And then once I moved to Cleveland and felt more settled, I started to make more garments this is inspired then by Korean hanbok, which is Han Korean clothing. So Korean designs, and just trying to create more of them out of paper. And so like this one with the pleated skirt is based on the turkey, which was again originated in Mongolia, mounted warriors and hunters. It was just easier to kind of mount a horse with this pleated skirt, and then they would have these sleeves that would detach on purpose, you could pull off part of the sleeve so that you could tourniquet your arm if you had, because you would probably get injured and be bleeding, but continue to hunt. And then I started to also do this. So if you come to the show that opens Friday night, I'll be there. This is one of the pieces in that show, and I became really interested in trying to take the actual bark that makes the paper and not only make the paper out of it, but make the pattern using that bark. So all of the prints are actually on this entire garment are printed from the bark that I cooked and then spread and turned into what I call bark lace, and then ink up in relief and print onto paper that I've dyed with various natural dyes, because that was something else that I learned in Korea was natural dyeing. So you can see that image is all bark, just 100% bark, and then this garment is printed right off of that one. It's a pressure printing technique, so it's more like taking a rubbing where the matrix will never get ink on it because the paper is between the matrix and the ink. And so these were shown at the Cleveland Museum of Art most recently this year in a show called Korean Couture, and I was really so happy to be included because of the way they displayed my work between two cases of 16th and 17th century tomb excavated garments from Korea, because so much of my work looks at Korean artifacts and comes up with like contemporary views of them. And so, like Jeff had said, I was making books, and so I was trying to figure out how do I also get my garments into books. So this is a book that Peculiar and Commonplace, and it was looking at commonplaces, which were books that people had long ago, where they would write essentially kind of inspirations and quotes from other authors into their own book. And so this whole book is 15 years of my own reading. When I read, I take notes and document passages from books, and I just save them. And so I went through all of that, and then I had another underlying narrative. So there was my text, there were texts by other authors, and then there was a whole idea of like a dressmaking journal, like manual. So each page had like fake instructions on how to make a dress, and at the end there was a dress, and then this dress is actually made on a paper that are all the printing rejects from making this book, because this was done all on an inkjet, and if you know anything about feeding handmade paper from an inkjet, there's a lot of terrible things that happen. And so all of those rejects I turned into the garment. And then I was also, even before I went to Korea, making a lot of these knitted books, and this is what I wanted to do when I came here, is create a new edition of them, where I make thread or yarn, whatever you want to call it, thread or yarn or string, out of paper, and I knit it, and then I create these panels that are, either accordions or, this is more of a traditional codex. And the text, the first one that I made, which is in the far left, upper left, was very much about the process of doing handwork to recover from losing basically a friend breakup, which is, I think, kind of worse than a romantic breakup, but, and the process of doing this. So much of the reason that I enjoy working with these knitted panels is because I feel like all of these holes create spaces for like slippage of meaning, but also a place for the reader to insert their own meaning, and also because I had grown up at a time where I felt so incredibly invisible, but also hyper visible as a Korean American in a place that didn't know what Korea was. Like they just thought I was either Japanese or Chinese, and I know this seems really weird now because K culture is so huge, but it was not cool when I was growing up, and I was one of only two Korean families where I grew up. So. This is a book that's entirely made out of paper, and including the covers and sewing. And the reason I wanted to include this is to show what I did after I learned this process, which is this. I call it paper weaving, but it's really paper basketry, and it's a way of taking strips of paper, and traditionally this would be like, you would cut up a book, or you would make a book, and the offset of the book, you would never throw out the the strips because paper was so valuable and hard to make and hard to find in a grocery store to make. I mean, to buy paper, you had to just kind of scavenge it. And then because Korea already had a tradition of basketry, they knew how to apply these twisted pieces of paper to a basketry technique. So this is my teacher, Na So-hwan, who, this is the only person I know in Korea who makes boards like this. This is a more kind of updated way of doing it. There's a traditional way of doing it. Instead of two working at once to make a 2-ply board, usually you make one at once, and when you need 2-ply, you make a 2-ply. But because I learned it this way, I see the merits of both. But and later learned that this is apparently, I had a student who met a woman who does this process, who said this is for man's hands and it's bad for women's bodies. So maybe that's why my body hurts so much when I do it. I don't think she's correct, but I think that was her way of saying you should do it my way. But and so this is pretty far along into the twine process. And you can hear, well, that squeaking. And so the squeaking is because he is using so much force, it's so much tension. He does this until his hands bleed. And so it's really, really tight. And this needs to be tight because this vessel is going to become a chamber pot and it needs to hold liquid. So it's actually a double-walled vessel. This is the lid. And then the lid is also double-walled, so he starts with the handle and it comes and turns it around and closes it in the back. And then the first layer of waterproofing is a sticky rice paste, and his late wife, who unfortunately died a year after I left, she cooked up this paste, and then after this dries, and then you coat it with lacquer. And lacquer comes from the sap of the lacquer tree. And that's a whole other craft in and of itself. And you have to be careful when you use it because it's the same compounds that are in poison ivy, poison oak, poison sumac. But when it sets, it's totally food safe and waterproof. So that's what they would use. This is what a bride would use when she's being carried off to her husband's village to get married. So that was what I learned from him. And then when I came back, I met this couple in Santa Fe who owned this kind of tipped over a storage container, and that's basically like for wine, and you just cork it. It's like old school gourd or water bottle. And I was so taken by this for years that I wanted to make something like this, but I couldn't figure out how to basically tip it over because he had taught me how to do everything straight up and down symmetrical. So when I had a different John Anson Kittredge grant to go back to Korea in 2014, and that's when I went back to him and I said, I want to learn how to tip things over, and he was like, why? And I said, well, I want to. And he said, why? And I said, okay, look at this picture, I want to make something like that. And it wasn't until I showed him that Korean people actually did this, he was like, okay, I'll show you. So this piece is actually in, this will be in the show, if you come on Friday. And then I did versions where I marbled. This is Turkish style marbling, which is like very, if you know anything about marbling, this is like one shot, and you only have one shot. It's very nerve-wracking to try to do 3D, because if you've probably done 2D marbling, where you drop a piece of paper, but 3D marbling is a whole other thing. So, and then this is a duck that's kind of, or a gourd that became a duck. And I like those kinds of mashups, you know, like a dress in a book. And then again, looking at old artifacts, so this beautiful Celadon ceramics, in the Cleveland collection, again, it's kind of tipped over. So I learned, you see on the left, I learned straight up and down, and then after I trained further with my teacher, I could tip it over. And then the one kind of really big thing for me was learning how to make these ducks, which I saw this image in the Mingei Museum. It was an exhibition held in the 80s, and it was all about kind of paper objects from around the world. And there was one spread, and it was one paper basket, and then this paper duck from Korea. And I just was like, oh my God, it's just so funny. And it comes from a tradition actually of making wedding gifts. So back in agrarian culture, a great gift would be a male and female geese. And you would bring them and give them to the bride and groom, and then they could have more geese. But then over time, it became just symbolic, and they painted, and they carved and paint wooden ducks to look like male and female mandarin ducks, because that species is known to mate for life. So it was to encourage marital fidelity, but also fertility, to have a lot of babies. But then I had seen in another book that sometimes parents would put in board, the wooden ones, they would just maybe make paper ones, but I had never seen this woven one, and this one just looked so wild. And so I tried to figure out how to do it on my own, and you can see it's like it's a very bad job. I was making this actually when I was teaching at Penland, and my students were like, Amy, have you ever seen a real dog? Their necks are not that long. But, so again, I had to go back to Korea and ask my teacher, and luckily he actually owned this book that had this image, so he didn't teach me how to make the duck per se, but he taught me, again, once you learn how to basically curve one side of an object faster than the other, then you can do this. And that's all I needed to know. So this was one of the first ones I made after I came back from that study. But the really important thing he taught me, he really forced me to do this, was to make a teapot. And he said, you know, after we did whatever, you know, the tipping over a board, he said, we have to make a teapot. And he said, no, I don't want to make a teapot. I don't need to make a teapot. He said, no, you have to make a teapot. No, teacher, I don't want to do this. He said, you have to do it. And, you know, in Korea, you have to do what the teacher says. So I did it, and and again, another double-walled vessel and lacquered, and I wanted to murder someone right where the spout comes out, right at that little crevice. It's like the hardest part to weave. But I finally understood after I left Korea why he made me do that. It's because once you know how to basically sprout part of something off of a body, then you can do this. You know, you can sprout wings off of a body, and then you can do things like this, where you open the mouth. Yeah, you can't do that if you don't know how to kind of separate pieces of it. And so, and these are all natural dyes. So this is Brazil wood shavings for the body, and onion skins for the bill, and then again that mashup of teapot and a duck. So it's functionally terrible. You know, this is like anyone who knows how to make teapot, you can't have this about this. It's ridiculous. It's like, but and I had a real hard time figuring out what's the handle going to be, and then I realized, oh, it should just be a duckling. So this is red onion skins for the body, which strangely makes like an olive green, and then Brazil wood for the mouths. And this is in the show, so you'll also see that Friday. And then the last image I have for you is another mashup. It's a duck and a book. So there's a book inside of the duck, and this is all about the idea of, it's actually a map, and it's the idea that I often feel like the reason that we kind of rape and pillage our planet is because, or how little respect we have for the wilderness that exists outside, is because we are so disconnected from our own wildness, like the things that are really wild in us, and that if we were more connected to that, maybe we would not be so fast to kind of destroy habitats and environments. And so this duck itself has been almost like sawed in half to provide this information. But this was in a show in Berkeley, and then was immediately bought by a private collector, which is too bad because I'd like to show it more. But I haven't had the energy to make another one. But that is all I have for you for this. But I'm happy to answer questions if you have any. I don't know if we should turn off lights or anything, or if there's anything, yeah.
I'm curious, do you have thoughts on where you would like to take your work in the future?
Well, I have lots of different thoughts, and I always, like with this process, I thought, oh, I would like to do more, like larger work, or kind of abstract, and there was a friend who was like, oh, you have to do like more of this biomorphic stuff, like look at what they're doing, and I'm like, yeah, I don't know, I feel like that, in the end, I'm not an abstract artist, and I almost think it's cheating because it's very easy to make basketry forms look like walls. And so I feel like it's technically not really that exciting for me, and yes, you can, it's something that like other people can bring their own meaning to very easily, but And the other reason I haven't done it is it is very physically difficult. Like whether or not it's made for my body or not, it's so difficult that I can't work that big right now, or I don't know, maybe not ever again. With the artist books, what I do want to do is I want to do more of the knitted. What I wanted to do here at the Book Art Center was make a new edition of knitted books. And because I used to only do, or I still up until now, have only done them as one of a kind. But because those are the ones that are so hard to keep in inventory, the collections always want to buy those. It's just economically, it would be smarter to make it in an edition, except that if anyone knows anything about paper making, dyeing paper, turning it into thread, knitting it, it's a lot of work. And so often the way I work is I can edition, I don't really like doing it because I like to finish a whole thing and then move on and be done. And there are book artists who they will conceive of the edition and make their prototype, and then they show you, and then if you want to buy it, they will go and make it. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to go back and make something. I want to keep going. So, and then there's also, of course I would love to work bigger. Like you saw the size of my MFA thesis, it was a 14-foot gallery, so it was 14 feet high. It just becomes more of a practical issue of, and this is what my grad advisor said, you have to store your art. And I pay for a storage unit. Do you want to pay for a storage unit? And I said no, so I threw it away. Well, I showed it one more time in a museum near Boston, and then it was so horrifically hard to install that I was like, the only way I can avoid this is if I get rid of it. So I just kept chunks of it and then got rid of the rest. And then if I want to make it again, I can just, and I've made other iterations of it, but I think the biggest thing right now is working directly with the bark. And I have one new piece that's in the show that I just made yesterday, but I just had to put it in the show anyway because, and it's looking at those door panels that sent with the lattice work that was made out of wood and then coated in paper. And there was something about that pattern. It's so simple and just really compelling to me, and I for years couldn't figure out what I wanted it to become. And then just suddenly this weekend I realized what it was supposed to be. It was supposed to be made out of this hammered bark. But I would like to work bigger at some point, and that's something that like the curator the Korean art curator in Cleveland said that she was saying, like, for the show I want you to work big, abstract, related to textile, related to fashion. This is because they plan shows years in advance, and I was like, I don't know how much of the four I can do, and obviously I failed at the abstract because I made for that show was why I made these dresses. So it was not abstract at all, but it was bigger and related to textile and fashion. But she still wants me to get very big and abstract. But I don't know. Sometimes I feel like that's just something that everyone's like. No offense to art teachers, which I am one. When they always, you show your work. What if it was bigger? Scale. What if it was just so much bigger? And it's like, yeah, okay. Do I have the money to scale it up? Do I have the time to scale it up with the space? Yes, that's great. And I think also some of that it's also gendered, and it's economic. I actually want to touch every piece of my art. I don't want to have a team of assistants making my art. And that's really what you need when you want to make really big work, is you have to have a team. So, yeah, those are some of the ideas. But I know that a lot of it comes just like with that door, just percolates. Or even with like the bricks, like that image was percolating. It's like, it seems like it's like a 6 or 7 year cycle. And then the thing finally happens, finally shows up.